The controls are unresponsive. These four words can be a death sentence for any video game. If you have unresponsive controls, it means unfair losses, frustration, players quitting, and of course, lots of bad reviews. But what are responsive controls? If it just means the game does what the player tells it to do, how hard could that be to implement? And how could so many games get it wrong? I mean, surely it's a simple thing. All you have to do is tell the game, hey, when the player presses right, have the character go right. Right? Wrong. There's a lot more to it than that. Making a responsive game requires an additional touch. It requires you, the designer, to understand your players better than they understand themselves. It requires you to understand their inconsistencies and then forgive them. And I don't mean that in a philosophical way. I mean literally building forgiveness into the design of your game so that even if your players aren't perfect, even if they make mistakes, they can still have a great time. My name is Seth Koster, and I'm a co-founder, designer, and game programmer at Butterscotch Shenanigans. Today I'm going to talk about our studio's journey through developing our upcoming platformer Levelhead, and the ways that we incorporated forgiveness mechanics into the game's design to make it a truly enjoyable experience. Now we have a lot to cover, so let's just jump right in. Now about a month into Levelhead's development, Sam, our artist, was playing the game, and I noticed that he was having a hard time trying to bounce off of enemies' heads. In Levelhead, as in many platformers, you can jump on an enemy to defeat it. And if you're holding the jump button, when you land on its head, then you get a big aerial boost. But when Sam was playing, I saw that he wasn't always getting the boost. I asked him what was going on with that, because I'd never seen that before. And he just said, yeah, there's something inconsistent about bouncing off of enemies' heads, and it only seems to work half the time. So as the programmer, I got defensive because I knew that the underlying code was so simple that there was absolutely no way that it could be inconsistent. Either you hold the jump button and you get the boost, or you don't hold the jump button and you don't get the boost. I mean, that's textbook consistency. So I watched Sam play to figure out what was going on. And sure enough, he was not holding the jump button. Instead, he was trying to time it so that he was pressing jump in the exact moment that he hit the enemy. And about half the time, he would hit it too early, but he'd get the boost anyway because he was holding the button right as he touched the enemy's head. But the other half of the time, he would press the button after bouncing off the enemy's head, and then that wouldn't count. So, as a designer, this kind of situation puts you at a crossroads. You know that your controls are consistent, so you could just blame the player. You know, hold jump to bounce. If you don't hold jump, you don't bounce. The end. Or you can recognize the truth, which is that people are inconsistent. So if your game demands consistent inputs, your players will not get consistent results. The philosophy of forgiveness mechanics tells us that we need to anticipate these inconsistent inputs and build them into the game's mechanics. People sometimes hit buttons too late, so let's just see if we can accommodate that by using a forgiveness mechanic called the coyote jump. Under the original setup, we just had a true-false variable called canJump inside the player, and if it was true, you could jump, and if it was false, you couldn't. And we would set that variable to true only if there was a valid jump right in this exact moment, meaning your feet are touching the ground or you're bouncing off an enemy. So the simple change we made was to turn this variable from a true-false variable into a timer. So now, anytime it becomes possible for you to jump, instead of being true, the variable becomes 0.1. And so that means that you're always going to be given a tenth of a second to jump, even after it should no longer be possible to jump. And suddenly, all those missed inputs from pressing the button too late go away. This technique is called the coyote jump after Wile E. Coyote, the Looney Tunes character, who would run off of cliffs and then only fall when he realized that he no longer had anything to stand on. And if you're really watching somebody play with this mechanic, then you'll notice those times when they run off a cliff and they seem to jump off of thin air. So if you're finding that a little tricky to catch, here's this same clip at 25% speed. So as you can clearly see, GR18, our protagonist delivery robot, is fully floating in midair here by the time the jump button is pressed, and that gets caught by our little can jump timer. So this is what a player would call responsive controls, because the player attempted to jump across a gap, and as far as they could tell, they pushed the button at the right time. So they would expect to jump that gap, and they did. And that's all there is to it. So once we opened up our minds to the possibility of letting the player hit buttons too late, we started to see how this could be applied to other areas as well. In Levelhead, the player has the ability to grab objects using a grappler. And this grappler extends up to 3 full grid spaces away from the player. And it attaches to whatever it hits, and then it quickly pulls that back and puts it on the player's back. So when we first implemented this grappler, we didn't think too much of it because it's a common concept in platformers to be able to grab objects and carry them. But because our grappler had a range and a directionality, it suddenly opened up a lot of really interesting mechanics. And the coolest of these mechanics was what our players came to call a package jump, which came to be the signature move of GR18. A package jump is when the player jumps off the package while grappling downward to pick it up again mid-jump. So this move allows you to use a box as a mobile platform to traverse hazardous terrain. And although the package jump was a really fun and interesting mechanic, we had a little bit of a math problem. The player can jump more than 4 spaces high, but the grappler only extends 3 spaces. So if the player hit the grappler too late, then they wouldn't quite be able to reach the package. So we created a system called cable stretching, where we would lock in the destination of the cable the moment you press the button. And if you happened to move farther away, the end of the cable would stretch to reach that original intended spot. So in this GIF, you can see the cable stretching in action. And even though GR18 here, when standing at the top, normally can't reach down far enough to grab the package, we can see that while jumping upward, the cable stretches that entire distance, giving plenty of wiggle room to perform that package jump. So cable stretching and coyote jumps are both forgiveness mechanics that work toward the same goal, and they both fall under the category of late input forgiveness. That is, they allow the player to press inputs too late while still giving the player the results that they expect. But even with our delayed input forgiveness mechanics added to Levelhead, we still felt like the controls had some problems, because there's a flip side. People don't just hit buttons too late, they also hit buttons too early. So to solve this problem, we need some kind of early input forgiveness. We need to let players hit buttons too early and still make it count. So for example, if you hit the jump button before your feet touch the ground, you should still jump. We can easily solve this problem with a technique called input buffering, which is when you store an input for a short time after it's pressed and then engage the input when it becomes valid. A simple example from Levelhead is the input buffering that we have on jumps, which gives you a 0.2 second window after pressing the jump button and it still counts. So in this GIF, we spawn a red marker at the player's feet the moment the jump button is pressed. As you can see here, there's no way that the player would ordinarily be able to jump at these locations because their feet are just way above the ground. And even more importantly here, 0.2 seconds doesn't sound like much, but this GIF shows that even that short amount of time gives you a huge amount of leeway, making it almost impossible to mistime those jumps. So once we got this system working, we found it useful to use input buffering in just about everything. Yeah, there's input buffering for the jumping, but also the grappler, the power-ups, everything that the player does just becomes much more responsive and feels better with input buffering. So at this point, we've now covered all the input timing problems. In our first design, the player had to exactly press an input when that input was valid or it wouldn't count. And this felt unresponsive and demanded too much perfection of the player. But when we combine our early and late input forgiveness mechanics, we create the input forgiveness sandwich, where the player has a nice wide window of opportunity where when they press a key, they get the result they expect. This is what a player would call responsive controls. So we've done all we can to handle mistimed inputs, where the player presses the right button at the wrong time. But what about situations where a player is just pressing the wrong button entirely? One of the biggest things we struggled with in making Levelhead feel responsive is that when moments of tension arise, players' minds can become somewhat disconnected from the controls. So they might think that they're hitting a certain button, but really they're doing something else. Maybe they're holding the button instead of repeatedly pressing it, or maybe they're pushing a different button entirely. For us, this problem was most pronounced when it came to Levelhead's fall-through mode. In Levelhead, after holding the down key for 0.2 seconds, you enter fall-through mode, which allows you to continue to fall through certain kinds of platforms or certain kinds of terrain as long as you continue to hold down. So here in this GIF, you can see a red bar appear at GR18's feet when the timer starts. So that's when down is first pressed. And when GR18 enters fall-through mode, the bar turns green and he begins passing down through the thin ledges. So this system worked pretty well, except when it came to performing package jumps. To do a package jump, you need to grapple downward, which requires holding down while grappling. But some players would forget that they were holding down. So they would keep holding down, and they would try to land back on the package and just fall right through it, as you can see here in this GIF. So we added some hidden rules to make it so that if the player continued holding down, they would still get the expected results. So first, we made it so that every time you jump, fall-through mode just turns off. We assume that if you're jumping, you want to go up, and fall-through mode is about going down. So in other words, we use one input to completely invalidate and reset another input. And second, we add a rule that fall-through mode only begins when your feet are on the ground. So that means if you're holding down before you land, then you'll get a brief window of standing on the ground before you begin falling. So when we combine these rules, you can see that the player can now just continue to hold down forever, whether they know that they're doing it or not, and still be able to perform a series of package jumps without falling through. So in this GIF, the down button is never released. You might think that these extra rules would add some kind of clunkiness to the controls, but since they line up with players' expected outcomes, they actually just make the controls feel correct instead of weird. So this whole concept that we used to solve our down button problem is just called an input reset, where even though the player is holding a button, we add rules that reset the input to make it seem like the player isn't holding the button and that they've pressed it fresh. As designers, we just have to acknowledge that players will sometimes forget to let go of a button, and it's our job to make sure that the game handles that gracefully wherever possible. So when it comes to accidental input forgiveness, you can go even deeper than input resets. Because sometimes you'll find that players will press a button that they really don't want to use at all. In Levelhead, we got hit by this problem in a big way. We had the controller's left bumper tied to the retry button. So if you press that bumper, it would start the level over or set you back to the previous checkpoint. We wanted to make sure that it was super easy for speedrunners and more serious players to restart levels to work on their strategies, or if somebody got soft locked in a puzzle, that they could just hit a button and just start over. So we discovered, though, that a sizable portion of our players, probably about a third, kept hitting that left bumper on accident. So they'd be in the middle of doing something, and then all of a sudden they would just accidentally reset the level. This seemed weird to us because the left bumper is it's way over there on the controller. So how could you possibly hit it on accident? We sat down and we just watched some people play the game. And we quickly discovered the problem, which is that some players just naturally hold the controller with their index fingers resting on the bumpers. And when something intense was happening, these players would clutch the controller super hard and squeeze it. And they would press both of the bumpers at the same time. And because it happened when the player was in the middle of a panic moment, then the player would actually have no idea that they had squeezed the bumpers. They didn't know they had pressed any buttons. And so as far as they were concerned, the level just randomly restarted. So fortunately, there's a simple fix for this. We just added a count up timer to the reset button so that the button would only be valid if you held it for more than 0.3 seconds. So this is enough time that it allows the panic to pass, and if a player clutched the controller, they usually would only do it just for an instant. And so by the time the panic subsides, they've released the button and they've stopped accidentally resetting. So sure enough, once we implemented this, all those complaints about accidental restarts vanished. So we call this kind of forgiveness mechanic an input speed bump. So rather than just instantly taking the player's input and engaging the action, for some inputs we can say, slow down a second so you don't hurt yourself. And when it comes to buttons of higher consequence, where an accidental input would be really bad, you might want to consider putting some speed bumps in there. All right, so there's many ways that you can forgive your players for giving weird, bad, or just plain wrong inputs. But forgiveness mechanics are not just about inputs. There are lots of other little things you can do to make your game feel more responsive to the player's intentions. For example, when we first started working on Levelhead, we kept running into scenarios where it was unusually difficult to navigate tight spaces. Like if you ran over a little gap in the floor, you'd just fall right into it. Or if you wanted to jump through a one grid space hole in the ceiling, it would take a couple tries and you kept bumping your head. This was all because of how we were thinking about our hitboxes. Under the hood, everything in Levelhead has a width and a height, which determines the hitbox of whatever that thing might be. So here you can see some of the items in Levelhead shown with their baseline square-shaped hitboxes. When we first started building the game, we treated these hitboxes as sacred. Any collision between hitboxes should be respected, we thought. So let's say we had a situation like this where you have some terrain and then there's a tiny ledge sticking up. And if we have a character walking along here and we take a rigid view of these hitboxes, then we would say that unless the character jumps, this tiny ledge is going to stop them. But it turns out that is a terrible gameplay experience because being stopped by every tiny ledge, lip, and corner just makes everything frustrating. So to solve this, we use hitbox pinching, which is when the character's movement collisions are based on some smaller pinched version of the hitbox. And this is going to allow the character to squeeze through areas that they otherwise would have had a harder time squeezing into, and then they can pop up over obstacles. So in our previous example, it would look like this. When you're calculating horizontal movement collisions, we would pinch the hitbox vertically, which allows us to pretend like the character's feet are higher up off the ground and its head is lower. As the character moves forward, this tiny ledge is no longer a problem. And in that same movement frame, we can resolve the fact that the character is inside the floor by just popping them up out of the ground. So the player can now move unimpeded over small obstacles. And this hitbox pinching technique also allows the player to run over small holes in the ground. So without hitbox pinching, you would often find yourself in this kind of situation where you'd go to run across this little gap, but in one frame, you can fall down a single pixel. And because you fell down one pixel, the next ledge becomes an impassable wall, and now you just fall right in. In Levelhead, when GR18 is moving to the side, we pinch the hitbox by 20 pixels top and bottom. So that means that while running to the right, the player would have to drop more than 20 pixels before they can no longer pop up over the next ledge. And when we put this into practice, we can see that now GR18 can run across one tile wide gaps. And actually, if you move horizontally fast enough, you can even clear double wide gaps. And this visualization really illustrates that pop-up effect from the hitbox pinching in a much more pronounced way. So as you can see here, Giratina runs across, falls for a moment, and pops up over the next tile, and that little bit of falling is forgiven. Hitbox pinching can also be used to let the player easily jump up and out of tight spaces. So here in this GIF, we're representing collision checks with these little green dots. And as you can see that when the player's jumping upward, we pinch the hitbox down to almost nothing. I think maybe the player's about 2 pixels wide while jumping upward. But that squeeze generally allows the player to sometimes partially go inside of walls. And so we have to make sure that we adjust for that. And that adjustment is shown by those little yellow dots in the center of the player's body when they jump around corners, just like that. And you may also notice that when the player's falling, we don't pinch the hitbox at all. So the player has a wide base on which they can much more easily land on narrow ledges. Hitbox pinching is a super useful tool that allows you to demand a lot less precision of the player and allows them to very easily squeeze through areas of the game that would otherwise require a frustrating amount of fine motor skill. So when it comes to hitboxes, there are a couple of other much simpler things you can do to get a lot of mileage. For example, we can play around with hitbox sizes and shapes as a simple but effective tool to make the game more forgiving. For starters, when it comes to things that are bad for the player to touch, we can tuck the hitbox in at the edges, making the hitbox smaller than the visual area of the object, so it's harder for the player to hurt themselves. And you can see in this GIF how these Spiketrons in Levelhead have very forgiving hitboxes, which allows the player to easily squeeze through a gap like this. So I like to think of this as those times in movies where someone's flying a spaceship, and there's always a scene where 2 big doors are closing, and they have to squeeze the ship through the gap. So basically, you want to create that feeling. And that's easy to do just by tucking in those hitboxes. So you may also notice that these spikes, despite obviously being square, have circular hitboxes. By shaving off the corners, we make it so that the player can kind of pass their toe through the corner of the spike, and that's still fine. It's a close call, which feels cool. It makes the player feel like they're better at the game, and it's just a lot more exciting that way. And on the flip side, for anything positive, we want the hitbox to be as easy to hit as possible. So for starters, we make it a square so that it has those corners to catch. And we also extend the hitbox beyond the visual size of the item. So in this GIF, we can see how these hitboxes of gems and Levelhead extend far beyond their actual visual size. And when the game is slowed down at half speed like this, and when the hitboxes are visible, the forgiveness mechanics are pretty obvious. But at full speed, without the hitboxes visible, it feels totally natural. And the player is not going to notice or be upset that these good things are being handed to them with ease. But sometimes, having a big hitbox isn't enough. If you want the player to really get that good stuff, you can add magnetism to positive items. In Levelhead, we only apply this to the gems, but in your game, you could technically do this to whatever you want. The rule we use is once the player has gotten pretty close to the gem, we have the gem enter magnet mode, and it's then just going to chase the player until it gets picked up. This effect is especially pronounced when the player is moving faster, like this GIF when they're falling, or maybe if they're being shot out of a cannon. So we use this kind of magnetism to make it so that the player doesn't have to backtrack and physically touch every gem just to collect it. If they just kind of like graze past one, it got close enough, then we just call it good enough and we let the player have the win. And plus, I think it just feels really cool to go really fast and just be chased by a bunch of gems that are trying to catch you. The last forgiveness mechanic I want to go over is the concept of a benefit of the doubt decision tree. This is what we use when a player could have multiple possible outcomes when interacting with something. with varying degrees of goodness or badness. When one of these events occurs, we walk through a series of questions that always leads to the most favorable outcome to the player. In Levelhead, enemies are the best example of this. So when you hit an enemy, there are some scenarios where you defeat the enemy, and there are some scenarios where the enemy defeats you. And the outcome totally depends on how you hit the enemy. So we can use this scrub enemy from Levelhead as an example. When you collide with this scrub, we first check the green rectangular area. This is the area that is favorable to you to determine whether you're going to deal damage to the scrub by jumping on its head. So notice that this area is larger than the visual size of the scrub, and it also has corners, making it easier to hit. And as you can see in this GIF, the player doesn't have to directly land on the visual area of the scrub for this to count as a successful hit. You just need to hit somewhere in that green rectangle. And just like with the gems, the positive hitbox extends far beyond the visible area. As before, this effect is more pronounced when the game is slowed down like this, but at full speed, this happens fast enough that you don't really notice it that much. So when you've collided with the enemy and failed to meet that first decision criteria for dealing damage to it in the green rectangle, only then do we evaluate if you're going to be harmed. And in that case, we use a second, smaller circular collision mask, represented by this red circle, to determine whether you're harmed. So it's possible that you would collide with the green rectangle, fail to damage the enemy, because maybe you were traveling up or something. But maybe you're still not inside the circle, so you don't take any, you're not harmed, and you live to see another day. And by using this tucked in circle, we allow you to kind of graze past and avoid anything bad happening to you. So in all cases, our goal here is to give the player as many opportunities to win and feel like they're really good at the game. And only when they totally run out of possible ways out, that's when the player loses. All right, so that's about all the time that I have. I hope you've all found this useful and interesting. Some of these concepts are a lot more complicated to implement than others, and not all of them will apply to all games. So how you bring these forgiveness mechanics into your game may end up looking a lot different than what I've shown here today. But that's okay, because the most important thing here is not in the specifics, it's in the broader philosophy that your players are people, and people do all kinds of wacky things. They push the wrong buttons, they squeeze the controller, they panic, they do a lot of things that they don't even know about or that they can't even explain. In other words, they're not perfect. But we shouldn't expect them to be perfect. As designers, it's our job to meet our players where they are and give them the best possible experience. And to do that, we have to forgive their inconsistencies and build rules into our games that accommodate them. And only then will you have a truly responsive game. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments about this talk, feel free to shoot me an email at seth@bscotch.net. Good luck out there.